This is Raena, and you're listening to Bold, Brown and British, a weekly podcast where we discuss what it means to be a brown person in a Western world. We've spoken about colorism, third culture identity, and dating, amongst many others in this podcast. So if this sounds like the type of content that you want to hear, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also message us on Instagram. The handle is @BoldBrownAndBritish, or drop us an email via our website at www.boldbrownbritish.com. So without further ado, let's get on with this week's episode.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing so well. How are you, Karina?
I am good. So first things first, how do I pronounce your name? Is it Raena?
It is Raena.
Raena.
It's like one of those, like it flips on the palate a little bit if the right person is saying it. But Raena Shirali, yeah.
Raena. Well, so I am delighted to have Raena here with us. And the introduction I got given by your kind of PR spokesperson, indebted to the Docupoet's tradition, Summonings investigates the ongoing practice of Dayaan, which is the witch hunting in India. The precarious poems explore how antiquated and existing norms surrounding female mysticism in India and America inform each culture's treatment of women, while also contending with the multinational intersectional concerns around identity raised in her debut collection. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah,
like that. Yeah. That's a lot of jargon, I feel like.
It's like so much jargon. So what this means is Summonings is actually my second book of poems. And it was born out of two poems from my first book, where I first came upon the fact that witch hunting still happens in certain regions, in certain parts of India, right? And so really the marketing pitch version, which you've read there, right? It points to a couple of things. One is that the book, though it is poetry, includes pieces of anthropological research within it. So it sort of shows the reader my experience researching and hopefully recreates some of that experience for the reader as well, encountering little pieces of research on the page and, situating them within the art of the poem kind of thing. And so it's doing that while also the second jargon flip thing is thinking about what it means to be an author who is not writing from Jharkhand or from Bihar or Chhattisgarh or any of those regions, but who is also still invested in that subject matter. So I think that's as pared down as I can get it.
Well, we'll get much more into kind of summonings and what that means, but let's start at the beginning with you. Tell us a little bit about you, who is Raena, what led her to I guess particularly become a docupoet, to kind of discover poetry, because I feel I go to many kind of poetry slams here, and what I really struggle with is South Asian representation in these. And I'm really interested into what led you to, first of all, kind of, explore that as a career path, but also to be I'm just going to start writing poetry myself.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're so right that there is not enough representation of South Asian poets. It's just now, I think, in my career as a poet that I'm seeing more anthologies coming out that document our voices and that gather them together and sort of promote, all rather than choosing the representative few, like your Aga Shahid Alis, kind of thing, which they're also lovely, but, there are more of us out here. So, I took my first poetry class in college, and it came to me at a time where I was really struggling with my purpose, existential purpose more broadly. I thought I was going to be an opera singer at one point and transferred from the college I had been attending. And I think it really appealed to me in maybe for the same reasons that poetry is right, embarrassing, right? Which is you can just lay everything bare on the page and it provides this opportunity to express in a way that we kind of can't in our daily lives when we're just in normal conversation with each other. There are things you can say in a poem that may speak more truly to your, emotional experience of being alive, right? And in particular of navigating the world as an Asian person, right? And so it kind of dug its nails into me very quickly. Like it grabbed on and it just did not let go. And I think it's important to say too, in like my introductory courses, which these are over 15 years ago now, I never read any brown authors to speak of, right? It was either, I was in college in the States, in South Carolina. So I was either reading white authors really specifically from the South, or like the token Black author kind of thing,
Right.
And then it was in the context of like the civil rights movement, or work responding really specifically to like anti-miscegenation or slavery, or, really grounded in a particular reading of Blackness. So when I went to graduate school for my MFA in poetry, that's really when I started realizing that gap in my education and taking it upon myself to dig deeper and search further. And I had some amazing, mentors and peers and all that good stuff around. But that was the first place I really met fellow Asian poets and realized, oh, there are a lot of us that are all kind of looking around and seeing no one around us and going, where are we, right? And trying to sort of articulate a sense of community and belonging. Yeah, I feel like I've gotten halfway through your question. Steer me back. Where were we?
That's amazing. I think it's always interesting to know that, first of all, that moment of where you're like, oh, I'm not alone. And it just gives you that sort of liberation, doesn't it? That, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one.
Absolutely.
And, often I think as South Asian anythings, poets or whatever, but you kind of feel this sudden burden to be like, wait, do I have to represent the entire South Asian community? And when you feel like when you saw some other people, you're like, oh no, phew, like it's not all on me.
It's so true. It takes the pressure off immensely. And I think that's another important thing too, right? When I got to grad school, I was writing poems about my heritage, but I was keeping them really close to the chest. Like I was not sharing that work with people. I was hesitant to even put it into my application materials for graduate school because I didn't want to be pigeonholed or to pigeonhole myself into having to represent an entire identity group. And of course, my understanding of that has grown and evolved over the years as I have too, right? Which is how it's so interesting to see how like as Asian artists and authors, our relationship to our art changes as our relationship to our identity changes too. So that has been a really like important part of my self-growth, I think, and growth as an artist as well. Coming to realize that there are more of us and no one of us can speak to the entirety of the experience. There's no monolithic Indian American voice, and yeah, I find that really liberating. Yeah.
A bit of a can of worm questions, and I'm like, I apologize for the question I'm going to ask.
It's okay. However,
what's it like being an Indian Asian poet?
Yeah, it is a good question.
It's just one that like I would hate to be asked.
It's a really hard question, which is why it's so good. I think that, it is at times really frustrating because of the way that the label carries with it expectations, right? And I'm far along enough in my career now that those expectations are being made very plain to me by virtue of what I get, asked to do or solicited for, or, if there's a reading and I get an email that's like, we would love to have, your diverse voice on the lineup. I have to sort of, push back and say, not participating on lineups that are all white, just like on principle. So yeah, there is like a bit of frustration that comes with it. Unavoidable. It comes from the label marking you as like the other, right? And then being the other being the source of the appeal around your identity, around your writing too. So yeah, it's a bit of a sticky trap, isn't it? Like once you've stepped in it, like you're in it. But in terms of like the personal experience, I think, growing up in the States, being born in the States, two parents who had immigrated from India not long before, and then being raised in South Carolina, there were just not a lot of Indian people around me. We had a very, very small and very tight-knit Indian community there of like 4 families, like, you know, who hung out all the time, dinner parties all the time, you know, kids' best friends kinds of things. And being an Indian Asian author is really the first time I felt part of a broader sense of Indianness in a meaningful way in my adulthood. And so that, I think, is the sort of indelible beauty of it that no matter how frustrating it can get, keeps me tried and true, sticking to the genre, you know? Yeah.
And did you ever kind of struggle with that? Like, do I write from an Indian perspective? Do I write from an American perspective? What is even this midpoint of like, what does it even mean to be an Indian, Asian, you know, Indian, brown Indian writer, or even a person, forget writer, you know, like the person, like in terms of identity and trying to navigate that, but through poetry?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like I struggled with it. I would say it's an ongoing daily struggle every day.
So it's a present tense.
It's a present tense for sure. And I really think that, like, so my first book was a lot about that, right? Thinking about like how pressures of assimilation have led me to, you know, towards certain growth experiences in my past that I like definitely regret now looking back, right? But at the same time, they're part of my identity, and right. So this kind of conflicted state of being that you're talking about, like the liminal, right? Like being between cultures, that sort of thing. I think that initially I tried really hard to resist the idea and to try to say, okay, I'm more one of these markers than the other, right?
Yeah.
And now I kind of embrace the daily struggle of it. And I think the struggle itself is an identity marker. And that is kind of how I have, come to understand my identity, like you say, not just as a person, but not just as a writer, but as a person, right? It goes both ways. And again, I find that extremely liberating, because it means hopefully no one is looking to me to speak to either or, but rather are looking for both, right? And the complexities that come with being both, and not looking for answers about how to, how to live best as both.
Yeah, and also it just makes you a bit more authentic, doesn't it? Like you realize that actually you embracing the struggle, embracing the fact that you're like, you know what? I don't know what that means. And as soon as you kind of accept that and vocalize that, it suddenly makes you like, oh, so many other people don't. And suddenly it makes you more relatable than less. And I think that's always a really interesting balance to have.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I was just thinking about this because one of my friends pointed out that in conversation, I will just say like, "Are," like randomly in, conversation with people who are white or just not Indian, right? And it's true. I've started saying "are" and "bus" like way more than I normally, than I used to, right? But I think it comes from that same thing, right? Which is like, well, this is authentically the thought going through my mind in the moment. And there was a time where I would have resisted it or tried to code it in a way that was fitting for the audience, right? We're experts at that, we people of color, but knowing that not everything I say is going to make sense to everyone in the room in a given moment, lets you be more authentic, right? Whatever. Yeah.
And why docupoetry?
I think in particular with witch hunting, again, because it is a practice that still occurs in certain regions, I find it really interesting to look at how the research talks about witch hunting. So not just like that it is happening, but what language the folks who are imbued in those villages, right, those sort of subcultures, are using to describe their own experience, and then how academics tend to kind of like diffuse that language, right, or desensitize it a little bit. So I was really interested in the play between, there are quotes in the book from women who've been accused of being witches and who've been tortured and who have survived, and how they talk about their experience as distinct from how, a removed party does, is a tension that I was interested in exploring. yeah, that made me decide on the form very early.
And what is the kind of language difference between them? As in, so how are the women that have been going through describing it versus these research papers?
Yeah, there's two really great examples. One, there's a quote from a woman that's embedded in an anthropological text I was looking at, where she says, quote, "The men had red eyes, the kind of eyes that saw no reason and were filled with cruelty," end quote. And she's obviously like, they're literally, the color of the eyes literally was not red, right? But she's speaking incredibly figuratively and evocatively and grounded in imagery, and there's so much feeling, right, in that quote. And it's not meant to be a literal representation, right? It's meant to convey the fear that she felt, and
it really captures it really well, doesn't it? It's just like you can imagine the people at that other end of that spectrum. You can see the vision that she's seeing. It just places you in that environment instantly.
Exactly. Which that in contrast to like Radha Krishna Kishore, who's like, I think she's an assembly whip for in Jharkhand, for a particular political party. She has this quote where it is like in the same body of research. She says, quote, "People here brand a woman a witch even when the well goes dry in summer," end quote. So there's this very like, it's the observational, this is what is happening, descriptive and observational, versus the language that comes from having the feeling and trying to encapsulate the feeling when conveying it to someone else, yeah, technical versus feeling, I think, maybe.
And so the language that you're using in your poetry, what have you aimed for? Because I find it's more closer to the passion and the kind of figurative metaphors and the visualizations, but I don't know if that's not that there's ever a right interpretation, but the right messaging that you wanted to get across, or the right language that was kind of intended for use.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And if any of my poetry students are listening, remember, there's no one correct interpretation.
Yes.
Remember me from the other past saying there's no one correct interpretation. And at the same time, I'm happy to hear you say that, because that's certainly what I was going for. I think I tend to write more lyrically and less narratively. Sort of generally, I'm more drawn to images, and I'm drawn to the way that a poem's pacing can encapsulate a feeling like fear or anger or disgust, at a phenomenon. And so, I think the poems in the book and the language I'm using in them are trying really hard to think about not what is literally happening to these women, because in many ways it's too horrible to even document, hence docupoetics and not just document, right? But rather the emotion both of those who are experiencing it and of what I hope every human with a conscience feels encountering their stories, right? Which is like to be swept away by the magnitude and horror of it.
Yeah.
And to wish a different life for them.
Yeah. I mean, will you do like read us a little bit of maybe a paragraph or two of the book, and I'll let you pick kind of what you think describes it best.
Oh, it's always so hard to pick between my babies, I will choose one. I'll read just like the sort of second half of this poem called Dayaan at Gold Streak River. This poem is written in persona, which means as an author, I'm imagining that I'm in the position of, or like speaking from the position of, a daayan, which refers in this book to a woman who's been accused of being a witch. I should also say there are a lot of poems in the book that address that it's impossible to speak from that position. And that's another like thematic concern, but I'll start sort of in the middle. If I say to one, it's getting dark, and she turns her head toward me, backlit by gold streak, says, but you are the matron of water, her eyes pepper swollen, limbs thick with sinking. If the castor plant grazed her skin nightly, if we float, if we float, if we float and soak the lentils and follow the field's rose, and if we came here as brides and they threw us a feast, said, welcome, sisters, I say, here we are at the end of the earth. If the sky immolates, magenta rimming the day as it dies, if it looks hopeless, if it is hopeless, on the shore men jeer and hurl branches, if we don't turn back, if we wade out together, cursed women, find mountains instead.
Amit, I love the use of the language of like end of earth and magenta skies, and that kind of, it's just so visual.
I'm very happy to hear it. And I think pink is also magenta, pink. There's a lot of pink in the book. I was just being interviewed somewhere else, so many interviews these days, and they pointed it out to me and I was like, oh, great.
Yeah, I guess I know.
Good to know, which makes sense because I think there is a comment on femininity and perceptions of femininity, fear of femininity happening in the text too. So yeah, a lot of pink.
So you said that this was based or kind of inspired by two of the poems from your first book. And how did you come across witch hunting? Like, how did you become aware of it? Because I must say, like, up until, I kind of started researching it, I had no idea that this was a present thing still.
Yeah, it is wild. So my first book came out in 2017, but I finished it, quote unquote, big scare quotes around finish. Okay, a book is never really finished, especially of poems. Like they can go on forever. Yes. They can be edited until the end of time. But those poems from the first book, I think were both written in 2014. And the way I discovered the phenomenon was I was talking to my great aunt, and she mentioned, like, I don't know, offhandedly, like, oh, better watch out, like, or the witch might get him. It was at a wedding. I don't know. Everyone was drinking, some chaos, mention of a witch. Then I later was, sitting alone at my laptop, as often happened in those years when I was in graduate school, just trying to think of something to write a poem about, right? Some material, and remembered that and simply Googled India and witch together. And the first thing that came up was an Al Jazeera article that documented, like, this is an ongoing phenomenon. Here are a few quotes from accused women. It's one of the sources that I've pulled from in the book itself. And that took me also to an independent article, which fascinating article, was thinking really specifically about how superstition plays into, like, both to Hinduism itself, which my family are Hindu, and to the sort of cultural beliefs that precipitate or make possible or allow witch hunting to happen. So I started to get really interested in those two things working together, like both the understanding that witch hunting mostly victimizes women, but also that there's this whole factor of our culture that like enables it, and that the belief in inexplicable entities is sort of encoded into the culture, and so I wanted to find out more, and that's really what drove me to research much further. I do not think a lot of people know about this.
No,
phenomenon.
And so I'm curious, you alluded to some of the kind of reasons, and I can imagine what the reasons would have been ages ago, or maybe even a couple of years ago, feminine cycles and, even childbirth.
You're dead on. Yeah.
But like, are they still the reasons now, or have the reasons kind of evolved and changed a little bit, even if it's kind of marginally?
Yeah, it's really like endlessly fascinating. So it's fascinating because in these regions, like the research I did was really specifically about cultures went from being matrilineal and worshiping goddesses, right? Like mostly having, babes like Kali be their, their go-to goddesses. How they shifted from that to being patrilineal, and how the same tropes, the same themes associated with Kali, and more specifically with one of her little goblins that follows her around, whose name is Dakini, like how she becomes associated with the trope of the witch. So that shift happens both by virtue of the reasons you said, right? Like fear of women's sexuality, you got it. Everyone's afraid of it. It just doesn't make any sense to people, and they want out, right? Suspicion of menstrual blood, absolutely on the table. Yeah. Victimization of women who've recently been widowed is also a factor. So when a woman does not have any surviving male family members, she can become a target, which leads to the second sort of set of factors, which is that in these villages, which are mostly sort of organized around tea plantations, which I found really interesting, reliance on crops for survival is high. And so if something happens like a drought or a monsoon or an insane monsoon, right? Something that gets in the way of crops developing the way they should. And let's say, for example, as a result of that, there's a famine and some children die. The village, like sort of collectively, right, experiences a great deal of grief and wants to pin that grief on a scapegoat, essentially, right? Like wants an answer, wants there to be someone who can be pointed at and blamed, because that's easier than looking at the sort of the bare truth of it, which is life is horrifying and yeah, and we have no control over it. So it is this interesting thing where it's like a way of asserting control in the face of other great tragedy too. So that's like the second set of factors. And then the third set of factors has very specifically to do with land disputes. So related back to the idea of a widow or a woman who, well, she's usually a widow, but a woman who, let's say, whose father is gone, whose brother is gone, whose husband is gone, she's in possession then of the land that she's on. And land is a commodity because it's associated with crops, right? And thus with the sort of main form of currency and survival. Really, all those things are connected, right? So it can be strategic to take land from women as well, from quote unquote unprotected women, right? And they are also lynchings, these instances, right? They're roving gangs of mostly men with weapons, and they go uninvestigated by police, as deaths and disappearances, and the whole village covers up for the group who have victimized the woman. And, in many cases, like I read a lot of stories of like police commissioners coming around and asking questions, and even people who, were friends with the woman who's just been killed won't give it up, won't say where the body has actually been hidden or buried. So there's a lot going on, that is not just purely hatred of women, though absolutely misogyny plays into this, yeah. Of course. It's just, it's totally fascinating, and is, I have to say, so much more than a book of poems could ever hope to like document, right? Which is again why poetry for me.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And it is fascinating that they seem so tribal, and it's almost like a tribal ritual with modern ways, modern methods, which just sounds insane. And I'm almost dreading asking this question, but you're talking about weapons, or you're talking about the rituals. How gory, how intense and gruesome are these methods and procedures that these women are being put through?
Yeah, that too was really interesting because I didn't expect to be familiar with some of them.
Right.
And I was surprised by some of them too. So again, sort of this like, strange. Every time I learn something about India, it's like it can serve as a mirror back to America in weird ways, right? Where it's like all humanity is thus reducible, and of course there's new factors as well. So something that I found interesting and that is familiar is the way it is determined whether someone is a witch.
Okay.
sometimes there are like tests, quote unquote, like trials, right? That include tropes like that actually I referred to in the section of the poem I read. That poem reads, if we float, if we float, if we float. And that's referring back to the old, like archaic tradition of putting stones in a woman's dress or pockets and asking her to wade into a body of water. And if she floats, she's a witch. And if she sinks, she's not a witch, but she's also
then
dead.
She dies anyway. Yeah.
Right. Like, so there's a lot of that kind of the catch-22 traditions are in there. But on the flip side, I think those were familiar, and I didn't expect to see that, wow, you know, just like in the Salem witch trials, also here we have stones in a dress. I mean, how is that universal? You know, like I'm fascinated by that. Yeah, a lot of differences too. Beheading is a really strongly practiced mode of elimination, execution for these folks. There's a lot of, I mean, I think tribal is a really strong and powerful and important word here, because the weapons are like iron rods and sickles, and there's a lot of just like beating with crude instruments. Yeah, pretty brutal, all told. Really horrific research. Cannot recommend it. Would not recommend it. Researching it for sure.
And just to clarify, it's not happening in America. We're talking about certain villages in India.
In India,
or,
yes.
Or rather in kind of particular villages in South Asian countries.
Yeah, and you know, it takes place in certain areas in Africa still too. It's actually like a bit more widespread than I had expected to find in my research. But yes, to clarify, not in America. I rather meant like the mirror that sort of that India's ongoing tradition of witch hunting holds up is back to
Salem witch trials and
Salem witch trials.
What you would expect to find in like 1900s America.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it feels puritanical, you know, like I can picture a woman in a white dress like with stones in her pockets kind of thing, but no, instead this is still happening, right?
I mean, it's fine. I was just watching Hocus Pocus the other day, and I think, you know, you look at it and you think about it, and it almost seems like comedic joke, you know, like when you think about like, hang on, these, of course, you know, fantasy genre, great witches, and it's all kind of celebrated, and Halloween's fantastic, but taking into account the seriousness of that problem, there are thousands of women which were burnt at stake for no fault of their own because they had you know, quote unquote hysteria, which was just grief, as we know now, you know, anxiety, or had opinions, you know, like they have just refused to marry for the sake of marriage, and that's it, you must be a witch. Even in the language we use in, you know, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, you know, like things like words like churel and daayan are so thrown about in casual sense, but then you kind of pause, you're like, well, hang on, wait, what are we saying? Like, what are we actually denoting here?
Yeah, it's so interesting because, I mean, it's October, you know, and Halloween is nigh. It's fascinating because another thing that I was so preoccupied by while writing the book, and I don't know that it's explicitly mentioned in a lot of the poems, but in a few there are teeny tiny little gestures towards it, is just how trendy it is right now to, at least in America, like witch chic is a thing, you know, like witchiness as a fashion trope is a thing. I see more and more people I like know and respect, you know, calling themselves the word witch, and something that really disturbed me while doing this research was really this question, right, which is like, what does it mean to be walking around kind of like self-identifying with the same language that is and always has been historically used to victimize women, right? And that is like, it's so upsetting. It's like, I get stuck on it because I find it to be so upsetting. I gave a craft talk like a couple years ago when I was working on the book where I was talking about this, like there's Audre Lorde quote. It's actually a title of one of her books, right? The master's tools will never, oh God, I'm going to get the quote wrong. The master's tools will never disassemble the master's house, break down the master's house. The idea is like, we cannot fight back against the tools of our oppression with the same language that is being used to oppress us. Like, and I think about the word witch when I think about that. But it's tricky because I also like don't want to discount like Wiccan as a religion or that any one person may have an experience that they, they believe to be supernatural. Like I'm not gonna go so far as to say like there's no such thing as a witch,
No, I think it's interesting because some people are using it because they're just not necessarily aware of the connotations of it. It's just so commonplace these days. But then there are definitely people using it as almost empowerment because it was used to oppress women. And we're going to use these same words to empower women and say, you know what? Yeah, we are. So what?
Which is so interesting when you think about the fact that those two things are happening at the same time, right? Yeah, so at the same historical moment, a big swath of women are like, yes, I am a capital W witch. Like, yay, turn the word into a positive marker of identity and like reclaim it and, fight back, take back the night, all that stuff. And at the same exact moment on another part of the world that we live in, right? Mm-hmm. Someone is being murdered for her association with that word that she did not ask for, right? Yeah. And that to me is the condition upon which the book was written. Is I was like, as horrified and fascinated as any reader of this book now, I think would be encountering that reality, right? And then seeing the word witch all over social media and around you, right? And thinking about it differently. And I think we should think about it differently. I don't know how, but we should. We should, yeah.
And because it's really interesting. It's something I've been kind of thinking about for the past couple of months, if not longer. I don't quite know, like, because I was like, I should do a podcast on it, but then I was like, I don't even know what I would call it because it's not even quite cultural appropriation. And it's basically all these like spirituality and like talk to the universe and like, crystals and all this, which are, again, associated with a lot of it with witchcraft and a lot of it with Indian traditions or religion, Hinduism and things. And I just feel like, as my friend described, just like what white person now discovered crystal, and it's just like, white person discovered and suddenly it's trendy and they're like, oh yeah, I have crystal, I need to like, use my spirituality. And I'm like, well, the thing is, this has been going on for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And again, like, yes, it's all great, but there is such negative and dire consequences to the aspect of spirituality. And I'm not even talking about witchcraft and like being associated with the witch and like, Dayaan. I'm just talking about like, women can't go into temples because of certain spiritual reasons. Women can't do X, Y, or Z, and even men too, to be fair. Like, I'm not necessarily, that happens more to women, yes, but there are also men that are affected by this. Mm-hmm. And there's so like small things which are now being turned into, I don't know, almost idolized. And I find that really fascinating, especially when you relate it back to what you're talking about in Summonings and, in the book, and the fact that these two worlds they're not colliding, and I'd expect them to collide. And they're almost just parallel universe. And you kind of, I don't know, I kind of find myself in the middle being like, I don't know which way to go, because part of me is like, yeah, you know what? So why shouldn't I embrace the culture around it and own up to being like, well, you know what? I am Asian. I do think these things. And you know what? Like, I was having this discussion with someone, I've discovered turmeric latte, and I'm like, you can't discover it, healthy dude. Like healthy dude is like, there's nothing you can say that's going to convince you for me to have healthy dude at this moment in time. No so way. Like, you haven't discovered it. That's like the OG I'm sick and then my parents, my nanny's going to force me to have this.
That is so funny because it's literally like it's the week of formerly Columbus Day and now Indigenous Peoples Day in America right now. And like it's a very Columbus mentality, right? Like, oh, I discovered it. It's like, no, you did not. This is only like what you're describing is tradition. Like,
So, part of me is like, well, I could be rich embracing all of this. But then the other part of me is like, oh no, hang on, because there are such, as I said, connotations and stories and personal grief that comes with generational trauma associated to these things and being, mocked for these things. And I find myself at a constant, as you said, struggle that we were talking about earlier, that, well, which do I go? Because it seems like this and, similar things to this is one of those things where you're like, I can't embrace the struggle because the struggle doesn't feel like to be the right place to be.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I think it's such an interesting vein of conversation because talking about who gets allowed into temple, or disallowed into temple based on, I don't know, whatever external factor. That is a huge part of Hinduism in a way that I did not expect it to be so connected to witch hunting, but it totally is because there's this, I find it very hard not to just orally plagiarize the research that I've done. So I'm trying to find my own words for this. I'm like, women are often seen as impure, but it's because I've read that quote so many hundreds of times that it's just in my brain. But, it's the same ideology that says women who are on their periods cannot come into a temple. It's the same ideology that sets up a fear of women's bodily functions and sexuality, and thus then, right, gets kind of hyperbolized via the spiritual, right? Or not the spiritual, sorry, via the superstition into a woman walking around naked, but bleeding, mysteriously bleeding in the village at night is a witch, right? So it's there is a through line between these practices that are so ingrained as to now be being discovered, quote unquote, and the way that real women are actually victimized, right? And tracing that through line was really fascinating and disappointing because I didn't want there to be a through line, but there very much was,
and it's particularly interesting, as you said, with using the temple, and women not being able, because this, I think, is just an easy example to use. That came from the fact that when women's on their menstrual cycle, they're going through a lot, they're cleansing their body, they're detoxifying. And, back in the times, it was, the woman is too godly to absorb these negative energies.
Yep.
And it's really interesting. I was like, how did that get then translated into she's impure and she can't come, when it's come from, no, she's at the purest she could be at this time. So she can't capture the impurity. It's almost like it's got flipped, and it's so fascinating because that's across the board,
It is. It's totally across the board. And you know what? It's it's representative of a broader cultural flipping that I did not expect to see in so many different veins throughout the research, right? I thought, okay, it must have gone from, for example, part of the sort of lineage and history of these regions and these Adivasi communities, which is what they're called, blah, blah, blah. That's so much research, we don't have to, is that women used to do the plucking and the foraging. And so they had knowledge of seeds and herbs. And so they were responsible for brewing haria, which is sounds like rice beer that everyone loves to get wasted on, which sounds great. They would find places in the forest to go and it sounds just a bunch of women taking a bath in an amazing waterfall and just having a great time, singing songs and drinking rice beer, which was considered to be holy, right? Too holy for men to be involved in as a practice. And even that, right, got flipped from being a holy sacred thing. Women have the knowledge to find this specific seed and then like to crush it in a certain way and then to brew it in a certain way that we all like benefit from, right? All genders as a village, right? Even that became, what are they doing in the forest? Why do they have secret knowledge of plants and berries? They must be witches, right? And like all of that shifting is at the same time mirrored on the religious level, because it also happens to Kali and to Dakini, her little like curved goblin helper who becomes sort of the trope of the witch. And it's interesting because even in like the way those goddesses and goblins like roles are, like there's diametric opposition even in there, right? Where it's like, oh, she's the goddess of lust and also violence, right? Like there's opposites held. And I do feel like this flipping has something to do with, I don't know, opposites and like the ease of flipping a woman from, oh, she's, you know, yeah, she's lust into she's danger, right?
Right.
And having our goddesses model the ability to kind of like flip back and forth between those two sides of the trope has like facilitated this in some way, which I just find to be so fascinating. Like it's built into the religion of Hinduism.
It really is. Yeah.
It's baked in, right? Which raises a whole slew of supplemental questions associated with it. But similar to how the witch hunting, you know, in Salem was absolutely tied to puritanical religion in America, right? Like religion is the root of these phenomena, ultimately.
You mentioned that this happens to mostly women. Are there men that are affected by this?
There are, yeah. It's mostly, when men are affected, it's really, really, really elderly and feeble men. So most of that has to do with land disputes, like that sort of third category I mentioned earlier on. It's resource acquisition at that point, but it does happen. It also does happen to children sometimes as well. Far less documented in the research, but I recently learned from that research that there are a couple countries in Africa where there literally are like PR machines that sort of engender like suspicion of children because they're more like susceptible to demons kind of thing. I think that's kind of the idea. Like they can get in easier because they're naive or something. It's something like that. Way less common in India, but there are other countries where it is more common and that I haven't done a ton of research into, but
because you associate the witch trials, the Dayans, with women, you know, and you don't even hear or really think about it being definitely not men. Children, maybe to an extent, but even then I imagine that to be like girls rather than boys that are being kind of.
It is. I don't know every single statistic, but in what I've read, I found a couple instances of prepubescent girls, which was devastating to read about. I didn't see any accounts of young boys, and I did see one or two accounts of elderly men. But the elderly men stuff is interesting too, because in the sort of world of characters in the book, and I'm saying characters because I'm referring to in the book as opposed to, you know, in every single witch hunting situation, there is a witch hunter who's also the village priest. Again, religion and this are like, you know, in bed together. And he's always a man, and he's also always kind of like the keeper of village secrets and like, you know, helps facilitate. He like purports to help appease conflict between villagers, but I think also like seeds rumor a little bit and sort of dictates, you know, what's the best arc, I don't know, for us moving forward. And so the couple instances of elderly men that I read about were very dictated by a witch hunter. And so I can imagine we're far more tied to resource acquisition, really specifically, you know, than any of the mythologies that exist around witches, because the mythology is all women all the way down, you know. There's not a single, it's not like beware a naked man is on your roof, like no one cares if there's a naked man on your roof, like quote unquote you're safe as far as everyone is concerned, right? It's very interesting, very interesting. Like practically anyone could be a witch, but in the mythology, one of my least favorite and thus most obsessed on quotes from the research in the mythology is, quote, "Every woman is a potential witch."
Wow.
So practically anyone could be, but every woman definitely can be, you know?
That's powerful when you think about it. Like, fuck, we're probably all susceptible to it, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I get asked sometimes, why didn't you go visit like Chhattisgarh while you were writing this book? And I'm like, well, every woman is a potential witch.
Yeah, like
there's like extreme suspicion of anyone who doesn't like belong. And I don't know if you've looked at me, but I probably should not waltz into a village where like, where women are so in danger. Like
going back to the book, you kind of spoke, I guess, a little bit about, you know, challenging in terms of finding the research very hard hitting and things like that. But what were the challenges when you wrote the poems or wrote the poems, but also compiled the book?
Yeah, I think the challenges writing the poems were really, they spoke to the more complicated component of the book, which is like one level removed from the subject. Like the subject is witch hunting, right? But there's another sort of meta apparatus in the book where I am thinking about the fact that I'm an author in the West, writing about a phenomenon in the East, having not gone back to India since the pandemic because of, you know, the pandemic. And even when I do go back, which used to be often and now is not, these are not the regions that I'm going to, right? And so there is like, that was really challenging. It was really challenging to come to realize, if I'm going to write a book about this, I have to address where I am on the spectrum of the suffering of these women. I read this amazing book regarding the pain of others by Susan Sontag. It's an amazing, amazing text actually about war photography and like what we're doing as viewers of art when we consume images of suffering, and like, is it salacious for us, you know, or is it that we are trying to empathize? And also, what are the politics of like walking into a war zone, taking a picture, going back over to the New York Times, giving them the picture, right? Like it's out of it's from the 60s, this text, out of a very specific era of war photography. And so I read that, I was thinking a lot about it, and I thought, okay, like I have to show me, like literally on the page here, like thinking about the distance between me and what I'm talking about, and grappling with that externally. So that was absolutely the hardest part. The research was the easy part, actually, in terms of following an interest into the writing process, you know, because I write very well when I'm writing from a place of rage, and specifically feminist rage gets me really far. And boy, there's so much feminist rage to have around this, you know. It was that part with those poems came easily. It was harder to look internally and like really critically think about, should this project even exist, right? And why am I the one writing about it? And so then to sort of say, you know, come to a place of understanding, like, you know, I think the value of art is that it allows us to step outside of our experiences, and then allows us to step back into our own senses of self and reassess our surroundings accordingly, right? So yeah, that was really challenging. It's probably the more challenging trope in the book too. Yeah, I hope it's not too challenging. That's my hope for readers.
I don't
Keeping my fingers crossed. Yeah, hopefully not.
What about, was there any particular poem or aspect of a poem that was particularly hard to write from an emotional perspective? You know, that it just, because I've had it with kind of writing where it's easy to write in a way because I know exactly what I want to write. I know exactly what the words are going to be. I know exactly how I would phrase it. It's incredibly difficult to write because you're so emotionally attached to it. And you almost like, if I put this, you know, pen to paper metaphorically, it's going to become real. It's there. And I can't back out from it. I can't shun it. I can't just be in complete denial about this.
Oh my gosh, it's such a real struggle. I articulate this, like, resonating with me so deeply that I'm just silently nodding with my eyes are rolled to the ceiling and I'm like, yes, like my hands are in prayer, I think the poems that were hardest for me in this book came really one step before what I was just talking about. Like before I said, oh, I have to be involved here. Before that, I said, oh, wow, there are like so many different perspectives at play, right? There's the perspective of like the Oja, who's, or Devar or Bhagat, like depending on your region, I just had to pick one word. White people will read this. I had to pick one word, not confuse everyone to the ends of the earth. But, I had to think about like, what is his side of the story and not what is his argument for witch hunting, but what does this story look like from his perspective, kind of. And I had been doing that already. Like there are a lot of poems in the collection that are written from the perspective of elements of the landscape. So like, what would it mean to be like the mountains who are overlooking this particular village, right? And like, how would being sort of an eternal component of the landscape mean that you've seen this dynamic play out time and again with, women over and over again. But stepping into the Oja part of it felt like I resisted it with my soul,
Yeah.
I did not want to. And it's been one of the better received poems in the book, which is, I don't know, I guess a testament to the fact that when writing is effortful and takes work, it is still worth doing. Even when it doesn't come from your feminist race, it's still worth investigating.
So I presume you didn't write it from a persona perspective.
No, it's third person. I cheated.
Yeah, sorry.
I cheated hard. Yeah. I cheated really hard. I sat down like, oh, definitely going to write from the Oja's perspective today. And like every day would just like push my computer chair back away from the desk, get up and leave the room. Just like did not do it. So angry. However, there are poems in there from the perspective of the village men, sort of generally, and that I could only do by relying super heavily on research. So like those poems, there's so much bracketed language. I'm barely talking at all. I'm just like,
yes, yeah,
just jigsaw puzzling together what I take to be the main factors behind the mentality, and there's so few of those poems in there, and it's because they were wrenching. It was wrenching to imagine the disposition or subjectivity of a person who can justify that much violence is really difficult. As a woman, of course,
So where do people find this amazing book? Tell us more. Where do we find it?
At this point, everyone's like, "This sounds dreadful. Like it sounds like
are you kidding me?
Traumatizing
this sounds amazing
time.
As a read."
It'll be a good read, I promise. So Summonings is out via Black Lawrence Press. Technically, it is not out yet as of our speaking, which is so fun and exciting, but I'm sure, by the time this airs, it will be. It releases around Halloween, October 28th. So you can find it by going to Black Lawrence Press's website and ordering it there. I believe you can pre-order it through the website still as well. And or if you were ever struggling to find the link, simply going to myname.com, raenashirali.com will take you directly to a link.
I will put all the links in the kind of description. Everybody, if you're listening to this, I expect you to go order a book immediately. Because I definitely will be. I'll be pre-ordering and I'm like, I need to know.
I'm so pleased to hear that. So honored to hear that. And I will say for, listeners as well, the cover is meant to give you a sort of gentle an ease into the content, take a moment and appreciate the beautiful cover too. My dear friend Mira Dougal did the cover art for it. She painted an original painting based on the book for the cover. And here, I'll show you. I mean, we're sitting here, but it's beautiful, isn't it?
Oh my goodness.
Gorgeous.
It is beautiful, but it is also like, I see what you mean. Like it's hard hitting.
Yeah, it's hard hitting and it's beautiful. Yeah, I think, buy it for the cover, buy it for the book.
Well, thank you. Listen, this has been a fascinating, because I every podcast you have expectations of what you think you're going to talk about. And, I was like, okay, I love this as a like creative Asian person. I love this. This is a good poem. I read some of the snippets. I was like, this is really cool as someone who loves poetry. What I love is like the bonding over like the feminist like rage that we've just had. Like, how dare they?
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And it's so cool to have this kind of conversation about it. Like, and I just like sharing space with other brown people around this book 100%. Is just invaluable. Like I can't, as opposed to having to start from beginning, like, okay, in Hinduism, there is a goddess named, it's been a real treat. I feel very seen. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you again so much for having me.
Oh, Mikey, you made it till the end. I'm so happy. Well, listen, if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to hear more, subscribe to the podcast on, wherever you are listening to this. We are on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Deezer, TuneIn, Alexa, you name it, we're there. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. We also are on Instagram, which houses loads of behind-the-scenes audio snippets, polls, memes, and ways for you to get involved. So go follow us on Bold, Brown and British. That's the handle. And until next time, keep safe, my wonderful samosas.